Hey, how's it going? So there's a few things I like to talk about on this channel, space travel, technology, philosophical mumbo-jumbo, and the thing that unites all that stuff is the actual goal I have for this channel. Ultimately, I want to build a community of people who want to figure out what the future of humanity should look like. Not just mindless speculation, but what it could look like based on what we actually know, and what it should look like based on what we can figure out. Which obviously raises some other relevant questions, such as why should we want any particular version of the future, and how do we know that we should want it? The question of what the optimal future is and how we get it breaks down into a million questions about technology and physics, politics too, philosophical questions like epistemology and theology and metaphysics. The scope of the question is ridiculously huge. Now, so far I've not flown too close to the sun here, I've not blasted out any videos too explicitly about this subject. I've talked about tangentially relevant stuff and just had a good time and goofed on things for the fun of it, and I'm going to keep doing that because, yeah, why not make everything fun and accessible to talk about? But in this video, I'm going to go a bit deeper on a specific idea that, well, it's definitely relevant. It's also weird. Let me just say, I hope you like topics that are kind of esoteric and unhinged, because that's what I've got for you today. The idea is pretty speculative, but it's useful directed speculation, I think. I want to show you a map of the human mind that, if you use it correctly, maybe allows you to see how individual human beings and the entire human civilization evolves over time. And if the patterns continue, it shows us on some level what the future might have in store. To be clear, I created this specific map by pulling together research done by multiple actual psychologists over multiple decades who created their own models, which tend to have a lot of overlap. So I've just kind of loosely collated the models together into one unified model and simplified the weird extraneous details. So it's not as if there's nothing behind this idea, but that said, I am very not a psychologist, so maybe don't believe everything I have to say. But at least anecdotally, I can totally believe that this, what I'm about to show you, or at least something very, very much like it, is true. So have an open mind, but also be skeptical at the same time. I invite you to use your own brain on this one. But anyway, this is going to be a very long episode, so sit down, grab a snack, and let's get to it. So the map I want to show you is ultimately a psychological model, but there are two major differences between the usual pop psychology stuff that you might have heard of and the model I want to show you today. Firstly, the model I'm going to show you is directional. It has stages. The idea is that as human beings mature, their ideas and values tend to change in ways which are predictable. Their ideas relating to what's important in life and how the world should work become more sophisticated over time, generally speaking. And the ideas that people hold change in certain patterns which are predictable. People tend to move up through these stages, but tend not to move back down again. These stages are the mindsets through which human beings evolve psychologically, and the map I'm going to show you isolates the stages and tries to explain what drives them. So in this particular model, you don't just get assigned a label, you get placed at a stage which, ideally, is going to change, as you mature. Not just from childhood to adulthood, but throughout your entire life, as you encounter more and more experience and consider things more thoroughly. Secondly, and what really interests me, is that whenever people work together in groups, the group kind of ends up acting like a superorganism, and the superorganism will be at a stage based on this model. A big group will act as if it's at the same stage of development as the people who primarily compose the group, and that group can be arbitrarily large. So yeah, this model applies to individuals, but also to households, to countries, to the entire world. So by understanding what stage the world is currently at, and predicting how the different countries and different stages will clash and interact with each other, we can see how the world will develop as we move into the future. There's loads of interesting patterns that emerge out of this model, and we'll talk about them as we go through it. You'll particularly want to hang around to the later stages because that's where things actually get really interesting. One last thing to mention before I start to show you this model is that it's important to note that this model is nuanced and delicate, and there's kind of an elevated danger of the model being used for malevolent purposes. Like, you could use this as an excuse to call someone a knuckle-dragging turbo moron because they're at a lower stage than you, and say that, well, therefore you shouldn't listen to them. But just to be clear, as far as the model itself is concerned, all of the stages on the model are necessary. It's not like someone moving from stage 1 to stage 2 forgets everything they knew about the world beforehand. As you move up the stages, you open yourself up to new ways of thinking, but you retain the information from before. You keep the healthy aspects of the stage prior and replace the unhealthy aspects with the next stage. It's a bit like going to school where each year builds on the last. In year 2, you don't think we should throw away year 1, you needed year 1 to get to year too. The stages here are kind of similar. For humans to achieve a highly developed, sophisticated, correct view of the world, they need to work through the stages. You can't skip them. You move through them in order. That's the idea, at least. So from your perspective, you'll think that some worldviews seem stupid because you remember having them in the past and surpassing them. And other different worldviews seem crazy because you've never understood how anyone can think them. You've never had anything to do with them. And what the model says is that at some point, you might begin to see some cracks in your worldview as it exists right now. And when that happens, you start to feel a bit ungrounded, and you often start to see that the worldview you thought was crazy actually fills in the gaps that you're now seeing in your own worldview. So you go through this weird transitionary period. You gradually take on the new worldview and eventually end up embodying it completely. And then the cycle begins anew, where you go to the next stage after that. Alright, that's enough setup anyway. Let me start unfolding this model in a way which is going to make it make sense. We'll do it one stage at a time, beginning with the first stage. Stage 1 is purely instinctive. Someone at stage 1 behaves like an animal, like an organism trying to survive. It's the stage you were at when you were born. Everyone starts at stage 1. It doesn't matter where or when you were born. It's not as if anyone has a gigantic leg up on anyone else. When you picture stage 1, think of babies crying to be fed, infants mindlessly pulling the toys out of each other's hands, animals fighting over food and mates. At stage 1, you really don't do much complex cognition. You just decide that you want something and you do whatever the most direct thing is to get the thing that you want. A person operating at stage 1 would take food directly out of someone else's hand if they were hungry. They wouldn't think twice about crying or screaming or punching people in the face, and for obvious reasons, the only adult human beings at stage 1 are people blasted out of their minds on every type of drug and alcohol known to man, or people with pretty severe mental handicaps. So either way, I can say with confidence that humanity is overwhelmingly beyond this stage, so nice one guys, we did it. We did one whole thing right. So you begin a transition to the next stage when you realize the weaknesses in the stage that you're currently at. The obvious weakness with stage 1 is the total self-reliance, but stage 2 is obviously an evolution on stage 1. Stage 2 is tribal. Think of how our ancestors lived some number of tens of thousands of years ago. That's stage 2. Yes, if ancient humans were hunting for food, they could do it alone, but they might not successfully kill anything for a few days in a row, and then when they do successfully hunt something, they can only eat so much of it before it starts to rot, whereas if they're part of a tribe, they do better. It just kind of becomes obvious to humans at some point that teamwork makes survival easier. Even just from a totally selfish perspective, it's good to be in a group. In a tribe, if you're hunting for food, at least one person is likely to catch something on any given day, so that's reliable food every day. You could go into the woods and hunt alone, but you'll die if you aren't consistently good enough, and you'll need to do everything yourself, and you'll inherently have to be more wasteful with the way you do things. Alternatively, you can have reliable food, plus some people who are probably going to spend the whole day just setting up camp and gathering firewood, so you've got a nice place to be. You even get people to look after you once you're geriatric and falling to pieces, when you'd normally die slowly and horribly being held down by a bear and eaten alive or whatever. Tribalism sounds like a much better deal to me. Things just work better in a team setting, which we all know intuitively because this is the basic teamwork skill that we learn as children. The fact that we get taught this explicitly means that it's easier for us to get to this stage. If people were in a completely natural prehistoric setting, a lot of us would never reach the stages that we've already attained, but we're elevated by the modern society around us. Our society has already learnt certain lessons, so when a society is developed, it accelerates the development of people within it up to the level that the society is generally at, which makes intuitive sense, I think. You can maybe already see a pattern emerging in this model, which is a gradual increase in the scope of self-identification. We started only caring about ourselves, only seeing ourselves as an individual human being, but now we identify with a tribe. You kind of rely on the tribe, and you fight for the tribe, and you're an extension of the tribe. You really think of yourself as just a unit of the tribe. So keep an eye on that pattern, we'll see if it continues as we go forward. Anyway, stage 2 has a weakness too, and the weakness in stage 2 becomes very apparent when the first person in the group has a certain realization. See, you could just let a tribe be a tribe, where everyone just does their best, plays a part, and the group kind of benefits as a whole. But sooner or later, someone is going to realize that there's a way to not have to sacrifice their individual desires in exchange for having things easier. People will ultimately want to have their tribe and eat it too. No, that doesn't make any sense. Anyway, basically people realize that they can dominate other members of the tribe. Like really, what's stopping one individual from telling everyone else what to do, if they're strong enough to do that? that, the dominant individual would disproportionately benefit from that arrangement. And not only that, a top-down command hierarchy where one guy says, I'm hungry for mammoth, we're hunting mammoth today, and everyone else has to bite their tongue and do it even though they were hoping to go fishing for trout or whatever, is actually more efficient than everyone doing their own thing and pulling whatever they happen to have done by the end of the day. A coordinated, strategic approach means your group does best at whatever it's trying to do. If you're doing this and you're maximizing the amount of food that your tribe can get their hands on, it means that the tribe can be even bigger and even more organized than before. You could even create formalized fighting forces to dominate other tribes. Notice now there's another pattern that's emerging in this model. Not only are the stages generally increasing in the scope of identity, but each mindset really is more sophisticated. Each stage has a whole other layer of integration, and a slightly more nuanced and complicated model of reality slowly emerges. They can abstract things better at higher levels. The first two stages were quite blunt, they didn't require much abstract thought, but stage 3 requires some real amount of strategic understanding of yourself and how you relate to others. So I call the first two stages pre-rational, and stage 3 I call proto-rational, which is to say, human beings do become capable of rational thought in some contexts at stage 3, but they don't apply it universally. In other words, when it suits a stage 3 person to use rationality, they will. Like, if you really want to figure out what's going to help you survive and manipulate the circumstances around you, yeah, you're going to be more happy to use rationality. But you're happy to be completely irrational when rationality doesn't suit you. So if a stage 3 person rules over a tribe, and a member of their tribe is arguing that food hasn't been distributed fairly, or that, I don't know, the tribal spirits they worship wouldn't like the way that the current chief is doing things or whatever, in that case, a tribal leader at stage 3 is not going to say, oh, well, you've got me with your flawless logic there. Here, take half of my food and one of my wives as an apology. No, the stage 3 guy is probably going to brutalize you for questioning their authority, so sucks to be you. Stage 3 does tend to come with a lot of heavy, egocentric, impulsive decision making, so it makes for interesting history reading, but it's not the kind of person you'd want to have as a boss. So, what's the weakness with stage 3? Well, sooner or later, it'll become apparent that not everyone can be a leader, partially because some people are terrible at it, but mostly because if everyone's a leader, who's left to be led? If a group is filled with stage 3s, you basically end up with the group devolving into smaller groups, each of which are fighting for dominance. And each group is also unstable because everyone in the group is trying to dethrone the leader because they all want to rule everything individually. This leads to stage 4, which is where people begin to realize we should have laws, rules, customs, traditions, basically abstract ideas that are kind of upheld by everybody, designed to stabilize society specifically as a reaction to the chaos caused by stage 3. Stage 4 is law-abiding, rule-upholding, culturally conformist. They build empires that last for a long time. They also create religious doctrines that help everything remain stable. It's very much a stage of development where individuals accept that they shouldn't have all the authority, so they bow to rules that were created by society and by their ancestors and by their religion and whatever, and they put a lot of pressure on everyone around them to do the same. Stage 4 is afraid of change. You have to understand, the stages see every other stage through the lens of their current stage. So stage 2 is tribal. It sees everyone else as a rival tribe, essentially. Stage 3 sees everyone else as a subject or a rival to be subjugated. Stage 4 is aware of the existence of stage 3 because a person at stage 4 went through stage 3 at one point. In a modern context, they probably went through it as a child, so, you know, there was probably a stage where you ran around screaming at all the other children trying to tell them what to do until you realized and society kind of confirmed that that wasn't really a good idea. But at stage 4, you aren't yet aware of any higher stages. As a result, stage 4 assumes that any deviation from the paradigm that it's used to is going to revert everything back to the stage 3 state. It sees other stage 4 cultures as inferior to their own stage 4 culture as well, because they're ultimately scared of change. They're risk averse, and they know that their culture has served them so far, so they want to uphold it. Ultimately, at stage 4, you think of the world in a pretty black and white kind of way. There's the way we've done it for generations, which is the way that I like, it's the way I've always done it, and it's the way that God wants us to do it, and that's the right way. And then there's every other way, which is the wrong way, right? It's a very kind of hardcore, socially conservative way of looking at things. Stage 4 knows how bad things can get, and it does everything to prevent things from getting that bad again. It's funny, stage 4 is very conformist, but depending on where in the world you are, stage 4 may or may not be the predominant mode of a particular society. So in places where stage 4 isn't the overwhelming majority of people anymore, stage 4 individuals sometimes think of themselves as these sort of common sense, down-to-earth rebels against how stupid and overly complicated the world has gotten now. In other words, they end up thinking of themselves as non-conformist, but then they have a funny habit of joining whatever the local non-conformist club is and finding excuses to gather in crowds of thousands and bond over the fact they're all wearing the same clothing or whatever. Again, I'm not trying to take a big meaty dump on any of these stages. They are all necessary. It's just something that happens a lot around stage 4 individuals, and it's kind of funny when you notice it. Another really cool pattern that we can now see emerging is an oscillating temperament as we go up the stages. So if you go back and think about each stage carefully, you'll notice that each stage alternates between individualism and collectivism. Obviously, stage 1 is individualistic because they only care about their own immediate needs. Stage 2 is collectivist because they essentially just think of themselves as a unit of the tribe. Stage 3 is individualist again because they find a way to leverage the existence of the tribe to work for themselves. Stage 4 is collectivist again because they put their country or culture or some general group identity at the forefront of everything that matters to them. And this oscillating pattern continues throughout the whole model. Similar to how the stability of the tribal stage 2 allows the manipulative, violent stage 3 to take advantage and elevate itself further, the stability of nations and empires created by stage 4 allows a stage 5 to emerge. It's individualist again, but this time it's more developed and less dangerous. Someone at stage 5 will do their best to improve their own lives in a self-centered sort of way, but not by going around murdering. Instead, much as stage 3 manipulates tribal systems created by stage 2, stage 5 manipulates societal systems created by stage 4. In other words, stage 5 is rational, scientific, financial, level-headed, pragmatic. They're everything they need to be to operate within the bounds of a functioning society. They're basically the experts in all of our industries that make society work. They're the scientists that develop new drugs. They're the engineers that know how to install electrical cables and build railway lines or whatever. They're people who get a higher education so they can do complex tasks for society in exchange for fat stacks of cash. Think about it like this. Stage 3 individuals think they'll achieve happiness by dominating others and getting whatever they want that way. Stage 4 individuals think they'll achieve happiness from the supremacy of their culture and them adhering to its rules and customs and all the security and religious purposefulness that comes with that. But Stage 5 individuals think they'll achieve happiness by accruing money, material resources like houses and cars and whatever, and also by the world scientifically and technologically progressing to make life better in a material way. Again, it's more sophisticated than the previous levels, and it's truly rational. A stage 5 person will attempt to make a rational long-term decision almost always, because they realize that doing so is a good long-term survival strategy. However, Stage 5's weakness is that although they're rational and they think in a long-term strategic way, it's not quite a perfect form of long-term thinking. Stage 5 thinks in the long term, but only in the individualist mode. Just like Stage 4 was a reaction to Stage 3 destabilizing everything, Stage 6 does something similar in response to Stage 5, because a society filled with people all trying to make the lives of themselves and their families as good as possible by fulfilling the immediate needs of that society in exchange for money will ultimately just destroy itself if that's all they're optimizing for, because the things that get done are driven by market forces, and that disregards things which are potentially very relevant but which don't have anything to do with market forces. So Stage 5 unintentionally incentivizes behaviors which might pollute rivers, just screw other people over, release hazardous chemicals and greenhouse gases. They might do whatever shady business practices they need to do to survive and provide for themselves and their family. But Stage 6 takes a step back and realizes how destructive killing all the plants and all the animals and wrecking the planet for future generations actually is, if you have the perspective to think about it properly. Like, sooner or later, we're gonna have to live in the world that we are creating for ourselves. A Stage 6 is aware enough to notice that that is going to be terrible. Being at Stage 5 provides amazing technological and scientific benefits, but at the same time, being at Stage 5, it's like a hospice that exists on a speeding train with no one driving it. If you're on the speeding hospice train, you know that the train is going to derail sooner or later, but you just kind of hope that you die soon enough that the consequences of that aren't your problem. Stage 6 is less interested in the specifics of being a citizen of the particular culture they're from. They feel more like a citizen of the world, really. They tend to feel like that's the proper context for solving the modern problems we have and living well in the modern age. They're very worldly. They tend to be very aware that there are lots of other cultures, not just the one they happen to have grown up inside of, and given the stability that they're familiar with, that they're lucky enough to have grown up with, they tend not to feel threatened by other cultures. So stage 6 individuals tend to argue that we should just be really accepting of all cultures, and we should all just get along with each other, and peace and love and everything, man. You know, that kind of thing. Although, since individuals at any particular stage look at everything through the lens of their stage, stage 6s end up being a bit naive. They can find it hard to see how going to an underdeveloped part of the world and trying to introduce people at stage 3 to stage 6 ideas and values isn't going to work. Like, the best case scenario is that the stage 3s exploit the stage 6s to get something out of them, and the worst case is that the stage 6s get murdered. Even stage 4s, which exist en masse in the modern world in the same societies as the stage 6s, don't really even understand the stage 6s, nor do the stage 5s, other than the ones that are specifically receptive to a transitional period right now. Now, this is a cool moment to look back at the model and realize that almost all of modern human civilization falls somewhere between stage 3 and 6. There are some remote tribes in the Amazon and in Africa and in the Middle East and whatever that are maybe stage 2, but the vast majority of human beings are actually between 3 and 5, really. Underdeveloped countries are at stage 3, developing countries are ascending into a 5. Ones that have been developed for a while tend to be sitting around a 5, but have growing numbers of individuals in them lucky enough to be at stage 6. Any place on Earth can have any people at any stage, but your local society makes it easier for individuals to ascend to whatever stage that your society happens to be at right now. But the society then resists you going further up. So if, just for example, if you live, and you've always lived, and you will always continue to live in somewhere that's very firmly stage 3, you're going to have a very hard time comprehending and moving up to stage 6. It's not going to make any sense to you. And even if you manage to kind of understand some of it, it's going to be really hard for you to stay there when the world immediately around you is at stage 3 or 4. It's going to be really hard to sustain. Now, a general rule is that people can only properly conceive of one stage above or below them. If someone's one stage below you, you just think they're stupid. If they're more than that below you, you tend not to quite believe that people could be so much less developed than you are. And if they're one step above you, you tend to think they're just crazy for thinking the things that they think. And if they're further than that, you tend to just not engage with them or think about their points because you can't really conceptualize whatever it is that they're talking about. Regardless, folks tend to demonize every other stage than the stage that they're at. And their own confidence in their own worldview needs to be shaken pretty profoundly for them to even consider moving one stage higher. Because in their heads, in everyone's heads, no one else is above them. Everyone thinks they're at the top already, that this whole model is garbage. Generally speaking though, conservative attitudes tend to fall between stages 3, 4 and 5, and more kind of liberal or progressive attitudes tend to be more around 4, 5 or 6. That makes sense if you think about it. Like, of course, society politically divides based on where the center of mass of this whole process is. It wouldn't make sense for there to be a political party at stage 2, because no one's there. No one would agree with anything they had to say. Anyway, I know I said that more liberal ideas are slightly higher, but don't take that as a uniform endorsement of liberal ideas from me, because the stages beyond stage 6 are where it gets actually really interesting, and they're really just increasingly weird and different from conventional thinking, to such a degree that they end up being kind of neither here nor there, really. Okay, let's talk about the stage where it gets really interesting. Stage 7 ascends beyond the normal rationalist level into what I call meta-rationality. The rationalist worldviews before this, stages 5 and 6, were able to honestly and uniformly look at basically everything through a rational lens, but only so long as those things that they were analysing were essentially laid right in front of them. They didn't quite understand the utility of actively exploring everything in a hyper-rational, self-aware sort of way. At stage 7, you don't just wait for a problem to arrive in front of you and then solve it rationally. You ask, rationally speaking, what problems should I be solving? Because it's entirely possible that the problems that your society has, or the problems it thinks it has, and is throwing all of its resources at to try and fix, aren't even the right problems. So maybe becoming highly educated and having an excellent career and doing all the things that a cutting-edge company asks you to do isn't actually going to solve whatever problem we have. See, at stage 7, you start to conceptualize reality in slightly different terms. You think reality isn't this one objective thing. Everything you think is a result of your perspective, but your perspective and everyone else's are all basically arbitrary starting points, and you're conscious enough to understand all of this. You realize that every opinion is valid in its own kind of way. You realize that you don't have this privileged godlike position of correctness in an ocean of stupid people who all have it wrong. Like, think of it this way. Nowadays, we all think that going around chopping people's heads off is a terrible way to live. obviously. But in some contexts, that's actually the only way to live. If you dropped a stage 3 and a stage 6 person into 50,000 BC, the stage 3 person might dominate the entire village and do way better there than they do in the modern world that's mostly moved past stage 3, whereas a stage 6 would probably find a way of getting themselves clubbed to death. So the stage 7 realizes that these different modes of living and looking at reality, they're kind of all contextual. Now, what makes this interesting is that a stage 7 individual views the world in terms of systems. So they look around and they see all the things that were built by people and all the things that were evolved by nature, and even things like geology and astronomy and whatever. They're all different systems that kind of interlock with each other. And so a stage 7 views everything as multiple nested systems that kind of interlock with each other and interact, which means they also view worldviews themselves as systems. Different perspectives are just different systems. Like, they can all be internally consistent, more or less. So as a result, Stage 7 is the first stage to look at their own worldview and realize that they're probably not completely and utterly correct about everything in the absolute sense. In fact, they end up being very relativist. You might think that Stage 6 was relativist because they had the whole kind of multicultural thing going on, but in advocating for multiculturalism and tolerance, Stage 6 were inherently against intolerance and isolationism, which itself is a type of intolerance if you think about it. Like, maybe intolerance is the right way. Stage 7 doesn't claim that that is the case, but they're the first stage to understand that all worldviews are these sort of semi-isolated systems that work on their own. On some level, a Stage 7 person can intuitively speak to other people at the level that they're at, or maybe from half a stage ahead to try and move the other person forward, rather than bombarding the person with talking points and rhetoric about why they're right about everything and everyone else is wrong, which is what all of the conventional stages do. No, Stage 7 sees all the stages as part of a developmental process, which means that Stage 7s make great thought leaders and mentors. To the conventional stages, a Stage 7 is just another person that needs convincing to join whatever their cause is. And the Stage 7, because they're meta in the way they think about everything, they know that that's what the other person that they're talking to thinks. So the Stage 7 just gently suggests potential flaws in their logic and ideas that may be why other people potentially think the way that they do, alright? Rather than arguing that, oh yeah, those people are just crazy. Ultimately though, a Stage 7 person learns to back off at a certain point because they're aware that on some level, only the individual themselves can choose to change their mind. Like, they're aware that it's totally possible for people to totally paradigm lock themselves into one particular stage for a very extended period of time and refuse to ever move. I find conspiracy thinking does this a lot, particularly to people who are only at the proto-rational stages. Proto-rationalists get very embedded in their worldview, I think, because they feel comfortable only rationally examining the things that they want to rationally examine, and they leave the full holistic perspective of everyone and everything that challenges their ideas unexamined and out of mind, which also makes them very frustrating to argue with. You can see this with particularly silly examples like flat earthers or whatever. It sort of doesn't matter how much you discredit their idea, they will just produce an infinite number of obscure esoteric reasons why, no, they're right, actually. Even if they have to argue that up is down and down is up and white is black and black is white, they'll figure out a way of doing it and justify the same nonsense they've been thinking for the last 10 years. You know, you can lead a horse to a glizzy, but you can't make it eat it. You do just have to let people figure things out on their own at some point. And even then, the less developed an individual is, the more likely they are to continue believing the thing they believed already based on the emotional validation that the belief gives them. So ultimately, Stage 7 people just lets people believe whatever they're going to believe. They happily play with and debate ideas, but they purposely don't get too involved or attached. They might like the discussion for the sake of discussion, but they realize that changing people's mind is a bit of a fool's errand. So they tend to adopt this very relativist way of looking at things. Like, you know, hey, I think this is true, it's effectively true for me, but something else might be effectively true for you, and that's fine, whatever. And the whole meta-awareness thing comes in handy because since now they're aware of the multiplicity of views in the world and the directionality of it towards their relativist way of looking at things, and they're aware enough to know about the gradual maturing of people's worldviews over time, they kind of intuitively become aware that they must not be at the top of this whole thing. Like, there must be more stages beyond where they're at. There must be even more developed ways of seeing things. And there is. Stage 8 swings back in the collectivist direction. So Stage 2 was collectivist and identified with the tribe. Stage 4 identified with their culture. Stage 6 identified with the world. What does Stage 8 collectively identify with? Well, Stage 8 considers itself to essentially be the physical universe becoming self-aware, much like every other conscious thing that exists. Like, Stage 8 happens when Stage 7 spends enough time and effort integrating all the different aspects of every worldview it can, and questioning everything in the very open and fair way that Stage 7s tend to want to do. And eventually the Stage 8 reaches the conclusion that, yeah, actually some worldviews really are better than others. Or, to be specific, the optimal outlook is one which most closely aligns with reality. And reality, in the mind of a Stage 8 person, is the conscious perspectives of all the conscious entities that exist. A sort of golden path for the universe exists, and it's a circumstance which ensures the objectively best outcomes, and it would be a path which maximizes well-being for all of the conscious beings in the universe. So on that basis, Stage 8 sets about figuring out how exactly to go about optimizing reality and producing those kinds of universally good outcomes. Someone at Stage 8 doesn't just see a video clip of a polar bear melting on an iceberg and feel bad for it because it's cute or whatever. They don't just sympathize with what they see. They really internalize the fact that there has been billions of years of evolution on Earth, where the whole tree of life has just been cannibalizing itself to fuel evolution. And they connect with the unfathomable amount of conscious suffering that process has produced in order to evolve the type of consciousness that they're now privileged enough to have. And they feel an almost cosmic level of responsibility that they need to use their life properly to bring about those optimal outcomes. So a Stage 8 individual is in the collective mode. They don't value career or money or even legacy, really. If history forgets who they were, a Stage 8 is fairly content. They don't really care. They just want to be someone who did factually contribute to setting humanity on the correct golden path. That trajectory which is objectively good and will benefit everybody. And they have realistic goals in relation to that end, rather than the insubstantial peace and love ideas that Stage 6 thought might be viable. And that said, as you can imagine, as much as everyone else hates their day job, a Stage 8 is going to be particularly frustrated by the fact that all they want to do is help the human species develop, and yet they know full well they can't force everyone else around them to develop, and whilst ever they live in a world designed around a human species with a centre of mass of Stage 4 or 5, they can't really make the grand commitments they'd like to. It's like, sorry Chief, I know all you want to do is sacrifice your life for the betterment of humanity and the universe at large, but we decided that your purpose in life is to stare at a computer screen for 16 hours a day until you can eventually afford to buy a house to die in. And I mean, nothing against being productive in a society or owning a house. It's just, significantly more mundane than saving the universe, Stage 8 sounds pretty airtight, but there are some cracks, and the cracks are very deep down, but they are there. The cracks are the problem with the philosophy of Stage 8, because Stage 8 is fantastic. Like, as a political model, comparing it to modern political discourse, Stage 8 is like an actual adult talking to a room of screaming children. It's just no contest over what's the more complete model of reality. Stage 8 wants to provide a genuine positive direction for humanity, whatever that means in terms of the specifics, and they're meta-aware of themselves and realizes there's always ways in which they're still flawed and need to improve further. But ultimately, Stage 8 does make some assumptions, and they're the sort of assumptions that most people wouldn't be bothered by, but Stage 8 ends up finding a way to be bothered by them, and it fuels their transition to Stage 9. The assumptions are basically just axioms, statements which seem self-evidently true, and if there are any circumstances in which they aren't true, we just kind of don't really care about those circumstances. And these assumptions, these axioms, are the things that ground our reality. So for example, we assume that well-being is good. Now you might say, well, no, we don't assume it's good. We choose to define some things as good and some things as bad because that's the only way that reality really makes sense. Okay, but that's basically saying the same thing, right? So, why is that the only way that reality makes sense? Listen, we say we want more well-being. Like, pleasure is good and suffering is bad. But why? Why is that the case? Aren't pleasure and pain just positively and negatively valenced consciousness? It's just a duality within our experience of reality, and other dualities don't come with a judgment attached to them. How is this different from black and white, or up and down, or the positive and negative end of a magnet? Why are we so desperate to assign judgment to pleasure and suffering? Why do we design our entire life around seeking one and minimizing the other? You'd see that this would be absurd if we optimized around always looking at bright objects and never looking at dim objects. That seems stupid, but why is pleasure and suffering not like that? It's not like our search for pleasure only takes up a small part of our reality. It's what we build literally everything around. It's the unwritten thing that every single stage stage up until now has unknowingly been optimizing for. It's the thing that we very well may end up transforming the entire universe into an engine to optimize for in the thousands of millions and billions of years yet to come, and yet all the arguments for doing so seem circular in a very troubling and unjustified kind of way. Like, this is a stupid example, but just imagine if the universe was just a simulation, hypothetically, and the objective of the simulation was to create as much suffering as possible, because then when the simulation ends, the amount of suffering that everyone endured is repaid to those real people who were undergoing the simulation, and it's repaid in tenfold the amount of pleasure that we ever experienced as suffering. Okay, obviously the specifics are stupid there, that's definitely not how anything works, but like, there's nothing to say that there isn't some wider context that we could become aware of that would ultimately invalidate everything we've been trying to do. Like, it's not just with pleasure and pain, it's everything. Everything is like that. Stage 9 becomes aware that ultimately what you think is reality is almost entirely composed of things that you construct artificially. All that actually exists is the contents of consciousness as you're currently experiencing it. Like, at stage 5 or 6, you can be aware of things that are similar in a more materialist and superficial kind of way. Like the idea that money is only valuable because we all collectively pretend that it has value, that kind of thing. But at stage 9, you're aware that almost your entire reality is constructed on top of what actually exists. And the bit that's constructed, it's almost not really reality. Like the idea of there being a physical reality, of 3D space, of the linear progression of time. These are not the objective things that we take them for, because all that actually exists is the experiential contents of consciousness that you're undergoing right here and right now. Like, there's your visual field, there's your auditory field, right? There's touch and taste and smell, there's your thoughts, there's your emotions, there's your memories. Whatever is occupying your consciousness right here and right now, that's what exists. And everything else, it's just an idea. It's just an idea that you have. Space-time, the laws of physics, chemistry, biology, psychology, they're all part of a model of how and why the contents of consciousness exist and fluctuate in the ways that they do. But the models themselves only exist within thought. You pretend that they're real, that they're objective, that they're independent of your partial perspective of things. But no, your perspective essentially is reality. And the rational scientific models you use to label and categorize everything don't exist outside of you using them to understand reality. Our models of reality only exist within the field of consciousness that we call thought. So your idea of this fully externalized, objective universe literally only exists within thought, within consciousness. So yeah, really the only thing that exists is consciousness. Anything beyond that, ideas about other conscious beings, or ideas about what happened in your childhood based on your memories, or ideas that there are other planets and stars, or even the idea of the rear side of whatever object you're looking at right now because you can't see the backside of it. All of those things, they're just ideas, and ideas are thoughts, and thoughts exist, but only within consciousness. That doesn't mean the ideas are wrong. I'm not saying science is wrong or something. No, our models are great. Our models are fantastic, and even better, more developed scientific models would be even better. I want a unified model of physics as much as the next guy. Better models would allow us to cognitize and predict reality more fully and more accurately, and that's great. There's nothing wrong with that, but none of that changes the reality that all of it is just a model, a thought, an appearance within consciousness, and nothing more. It doesn't need to be anything more. It's fine as a model. Stage 9 is ultimately construct aware. They don't dislike the constructs, they're just aware that so much of reality is a mental construct. And stage 9 feels very ungrounded because much of what they used to feel is certain is now recognized as just a construct. Even basic ideas like good and bad can't really be trusted. But it's not as if you have any alternatives. Stage 9 doesn't really know what the alternatives are, so stage 9 feels the need to try and design more and more detailed models of how they think reality maybe actually works. And as a result of the whole groundlessness thing, they're excellent at the kind of multi-perspective thinking you'd expect of stage 7, but even more so. Stage 9 juggle different paradigms like nobody's business. They come up with, construct and deconstruct their own ideas of how systems and concepts and worlds interrelate, so they're a very strong cross-paradigm thinker. They can take on some new and weird paradigm very easily in ways that other stages really can't do. Although the elusive search for the perfect model that really explains how reality actually works can become very frustrating, because stage 9 is continuously seeking something, and they're never really finding resolution. Here's where we can notice the final pattern in this model, because the final pattern kind of unfolds throughout the entire course of the model. Stages 1 to 5 construct increasingly detailed models of reality on top of the previous models. You go from surviving alone to operating rationally within a society. Each time the stages build on each other, they add complexity. But between 5 and 6, there's a bit of a realization that building on top of an existing model doesn't necessarily result in better outcomes. So stages 6 through 10 question the existing constructs and deconstruct them as much as they construct new ones. And this has actually started to show up in the modern day, because there are stage 6 people around. The stages are coming faster and faster as the world's living conditions globally increase. Stage 3 is probably many thousands of years old. Stage 4 is kind of biblical and imperial thinking, so it's single-digit thousands of years old. Stage 5 is modern post-Renaissance thinking. That's a few hundred years old. The beginning of stage 6 was postmodern thinking, I guess. I mean, it only really showed up last century, and whilst I'll throw my opinion in here, I'd personally say that a lot of the turbo-progressive stuff in society right now is ideas which originally arrived with the stage 6 thinking, but which were kind of usurped in some ways by stage 4s, who are essentially just trying to create a cultural in-group. And those stage 4s ended up expanding on those sort of postmodern ideas in ways which degraded them and made them seem stupider than they actually are to a general populace who is at stage 4 and 5. Like, the original stage 6 ideas in their purest, abstracted form are actually pretty good. You know, I hate all this culture war crap, but ideas like, you know, traditional gendered stereotypes are kind of arbitrary, and they're a bit pointless to enforce on everyone. Like, that's a good idea, but the stage 4 interpretation of it, which is like, you know, there's an infinite number of genders, all of which have pronouns you now have to learn individually, and I identify as a turnip, that's not so much. But the deconstruction itself isn't a bad thing. It's just been wielded by undeveloped people, in my opinion. Anyway, the whole deconstruction thing continues from stage 6 all the way into stage 9, where eventually all the complexity of removing and reforming and cutting away and constructing and deconstructing notions of what reality exactly is and exactly how it works comes to a head. And at stage 10, it all resolves. Stage 10 is where all that complexity collapses back into simplicity. At some point, you manage to get your brain to fully internalize the fact that you cannot attain pure truth through symbolic representation. If you try to, the truth that you'll encounter will necessarily be partial. So if you have some statement about reality that's written in words, so symbols, or they're communicated with spoken words, or through a diagram, or a picture, or a tradition, or an archetype, or any kind of model or symbol whatsoever, it cannot be completely representative of the truth, because the truth is direct conscious experience of reality. That's what truth must be, definitionally. And a symbol, definitionally, is not that. A symbol represents something which the symbol itself is not. And when the stage 9 person realizes that and fully internalizes it, all the questions around what the best model is stops. Like, you can design incredible models of reality, but ultimately, in all of its totality, reality is not really modelable. And it doesn't really need to be modeled. It just needs to be, which is what it's doing anyway. So people at stage 10 don't really judge particular experiences within consciousness. They're open to whatever it is that occupies their consciousness. Whether the contents of consciousness is pleasure or pain, they don't judge it. Like, they really don't judge it. They just experience it for what it actually is, because that's just what reality happens to be doing right now. And stage 10 people don't feel incomplete in the way the rest of us do. They don't feel insecure. They're content. They're really at peace. You know the whole business with like the Buddha meditating beneath a tree and achieving enlightenment or whatever? Yeah, it's basically that, I reckon. This whole model is kind of a path to enlightenment, or in less religious language, it's a map of how humans come to find the ultimate truth of reality. That reality kind of just simply is, in a sense. The whole non-duality thing, if you're familiar with that, comes along for the ride, since the separation of the concept of self from any other part of consciousness is in and of itself a model, so that's a symbolic representation of how consciousness works, which therefore must be different from how it actually works. Consciousness is one unified thing. You know, it's effectively indistinguishable from the concept of reality at large. It's all that exists, and it just is. That's stage 10. So hell yeah, nice one, we got to the end of the model. Now, where the hell did I actually get this model? Well, this model is a bit of my interpretation and it's an integration of 2 or 3 different sources. One source in particular has kind of most of it, but I've taken little bits here and there from all over the place. First off, there was a psychological model constructed by a guy called Claire Graves, which produced an open-ended set of developmental levels. His approach was fairly scientific, although it did notably suffer from some sampling bias, so it wasn't exactly flipping the table on all of psychology or anything. Then there was spiral dynamics, which was a model which was developed out of Graves' work by 2 guys called Don Beck and Christopher Cohen. This was much more heavily criticized as being kind of ideological and a bit culty, but I still enjoyed looking into it, and the lower stages here do reflect that model a fair amount. Then there's Jane Lovinger, I think that's how you pronounce the name, who developed a theory of personality using a methodology of sentence completion tests, and she came up with a model called the stages of ego development, which were then further refined by someone called Suzanne Cook-Greuter, and that model has a lot of similarities with the kind of stages 6 through 10 of my model, and it also aligns with the kind of spiral dynamics models-ish. So I've just taken all of these, rejigged the terminology a bit, and created something kind of unified out of it to the best of my ability. Now, all these models and the methodologies they use have kind of varying levels of scientific validity. Like, some are pretty decent and some are pretty pseudoscience-y, so I'll just let it be your call as to whether you think any of them are valid or whether they're all garbage, or what you think of the model I've got on screen here, if you think that is great or if you think it's terrible. But I will admit, at least from an anecdotal perspective, this model here, like, I can personally believe that something like this is correct. In my head, it really does make sense, I think. Although I will say, I very much consider the details of this exact model to be essentially a work in progress. I don't consider this to be absolute and final and definite. Like, I've gone ahead and integrated things in a way that makes sense to me, but ultimately it's up to you if you want to reject this model. But I kind of like it, and it's very fun to think about at the very least. And it's fun to envision a future where we get to a point where we're trying to optimize impacts on the universe via, whatever technology we have, like Dyson sphere-powered interstellar cybernetic genetic engineering nonsense, whatever it is that we come up with. And that's what society's trying to do. But then meanwhile, maybe conservative thinkers aren't convinced by that, and they think we should use, AI-powered supercomputers to use this whole systems thinking analysis to explore every conceivable viewpoint before we get too hasty. And then progressives in the society are trying to outdo each other with new, increasingly weird models of how reality works. Like, it's trippy and cool to think about how this might go. Of course, that does assume that things go pretty well. Now, I know I said that people just move up this model, but a society makes new people all the time, and a time of hardship can make it harder for a new generation to make their way up these stages. It's also technically possible to regress as an individual too. It pretty much has to be under kind of terrible life circumstances though, because that pushes you down into a more frantic, instinctual survival mode of looking at the world. So if you lose a job and you go through a divorce and some of your family members die and you fall out with all of your friends all at the same time, then yeah, you're at risk of devolving by a stage, maybe even 2 stages. Particularly if parts of you are still present at a lower stage, which is something worth mentioning too. It's not as if a person or a culture is entirely at one particular stage of development, and this is why this model is kind of delicate and nuanced. You could be 25% at stage 6, 50% at stage 5 and 25% at stage 4. Like, different aspects of a person can be more or less developed. Like, you could have better cognition but lower emotional capacity, and your morals are somewhere in the middle, or whatever. But I find that way of trying to categorize the different aspects a bit vague though. Like, how many independent axes are there exactly? It's kind of up in the air. It'd be nice to come up with a more rigorous model of that aspect specifically, but I don't know. So I just kind of tend not to get too hung up on the details. I just feel out where I'm mostly at when I'm looking at this model. I just try to not leave any obvious places of myself at lower stages. I've heard leftover remnants of your psyche left at lower stages being referred to as shadow aspects, which, damn, that sounds like a Yu-Gi-Oh card. A good way to make sure that that kind of thing doesn't happen is by fully exploring each stage before you try and move on. Again, this is why you can't really jump stages. You could easily spend 10 years at each stage from proto-irrational onwards to fully exhaust it. But when you do try to advance forward, and I know I've said this before, but I'll say it again, you can't jump stages. Just to help you out with this, like, most people will think of themselves as about 2 stages higher than they actually are, because you're going to either like the individualist mindset or the collectivist mindset, and being only 1 stage higher would put you in a position that you probably actively disagree with right now. But, like, not everyone will overestimate themselves. Some people will underestimate where they are, but most people go over. So just notice that, statistically speaking, you're probably lower down on the model than you would like to think that you are, although I'll leave the ball in your court to determine where you really really think you are exactly. Just notice that there's no circumnavigating the next stage from where you really are currently. You need to go up through that next stage directly. And if you try and jump a stage, you'll just be a confused and frustrated version of the stage you're at right now. Because getting to the next one is always a logical evolution from where you are, an evolution that addresses the specific pitfalls of where you are. So trying to jump 2 stages or more at once is exactly the kind of egoic nonsense that guarantees you're going to move absolutely nowhere whatsoever. Anyway, final word. If you decide to retain this information, and don't just throw it out and say that this model's stupid, try and use it for good. Like, don't use it to be an asshole. Because remember, if you're using it to judge other stages, that necessarily means you're not that developed either. So if I see anyone doing that in the comments, I'm going to print out a picture of this diagram, wrap it around a cricket bat and clobber you with it. Alright, that'll do. Good lord, this video was long. I feel like I've grown a beard throughout the course of this video. Thanks for watching till the end, everybody. Like and subscribe if you want. Thanks again to elite level channel member Thunderbolt22810. I don't think I've ever seen him and Danny DeVito in the same room at the same time, and I'm beginning to suspect that something's up with that. Now I know what you're thinking, Zan, that's just a coincidence, but I think it might have to do more with the fact that I have no idea what this guy looks like. Anyway, big thanks to my other channel members too, and if you're still watching, feel free to join the channel. I've got a bunch of cool YouTube membership perks if you're into that kind of thing, and as always, I'll catch you in the next one. Over and out.